So for my political topic, I would primarily focus on the administrative state and bureaucracy, kind of how the way our executive level of government behaves regarding certain legal action. I know that sounded kind of vague, so I'm going to give a little brief history lesson and then go into what my policy would do and the impacts of that. So the modern administrative state that a lot of our federal agencies run off of, such as Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Education, Social Security, Census Bureau, all the various government agencies, they stem from a theory of government coming from German political philosophy under a guy named Hegel. Woodrow Wilson was the guy who adopted Hegel's theory and called for a large bureaucracy administrative state. I'll attach Wilson's document below, a study on bureaucracy, and basically said that we needed governmental agencies that could act and conduct administrative function that were separate from the political sphere. That just because an election happened and parties changed, that didn't prevent government from taking actions for managing the country, which sounds all and good, but if the administrative state gets political itself, then that means it doesn't matter who's in power, certain agendas being pressed forward anyway, which I think has contributed a lot to some of people's disaffection with our government. It doesn't matter who's in office, we can't seem to get what we want done. It's because there's an administrative state that's immune to politics, kind of like how justices are rightfully immune to basically political action by having, like, they don't face elections, so they're allowed to take action. For the justices, it's by design, because we desire them to act independently and act as free thinkers. But for administrative agencies, because that's just a part of government that was intended to be based on election and based on the will of the people, it kind of goes against what that is. So my policy would be repealing a judicial doctrine called Chevron deference. Chevron deference was initiated in the 1970s in Chevron versus, I'll attach the court case, I forget who it was, but essentially it was an environmental agency that was sort of suing Chevron, and based on the way the EPA regulated pollution emissions. And what Chevron, the impact of this court case was the Supreme Court ruled that an administrative agency, if it makes a regulation, can have the authority to interpret that regulation within a certain scope. So for example, if Congress passes a law that says, I don't know, the EPA has to regulate pollution in rivers, and it doesn't say how to do it, the EPA may then make their own regulation as they see fit, and then interpret that as they see fit, and the courts will accept that unless it's like a blatant violation of amendment rights. And so the concern with that is that you have an executive agency like the EPA or Social Security doing legislative powers and doing judicial powers, interpretation and making regulation, when they're in the executive branch. And so the threat is that that is interrupting separation of powers, and that's encouraged the increasing power of the executive branch over the past several decades. So for my policy, what I am not saying is remove all executive agencies. They're evil. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying, because it's important for the president to have his cabinet, and it's important for the president to be able to execute the law, and so the administrative agencies allow for that. But we need to take away those powers that give it legislative power and give it judicial power, because those are outside the principle of separation of powers. The ramifications of this is that more of the burden will be placed on Congress. Right now, Congress doesn't do a lot of nitty-gritty details in the budget. One of the benefits of Chevron deference is that they're able to look at the budget in overarching ways, and then the nitty-gritty details are sort of at the regulatory level. This would force Congress to be honest with the budget down to the nitty-gritty details, which would be a pain, but in terms of ensuring separation of powers and ensuring that our government maintains its function that protects liberty, I think that's necessary, because consolidating power to the executive branch is only going to encourage dictatorship down the run, especially if Congress continues to not do its job because it doesn't have that burden and is able to kick the can down the road. That's only going to encourage the executive branch to continue taking more power. And members of all sides of the political spectrum do acknowledge that the administrative state needs reform. if you look at the conservative end, you have a couple writers such as Phil Lawson. I'll attach an article by him on it below. John Marini in his book Unmasking the Administrative State, and Philip Hamburger's The Administrative Threat. I would have shown you these books, but I kind of already took them to my classroom, and my college level students are going to be looking at that in a little bit. But that's they sort of come up, assert that argument of we need to go back to separation of powers. And then another one from a more liberal perspective is Cass Sunstein's After the Rights Revolution, where, I mean, he was the manager of the OMB Office of Management and Budget, which is basically the organization that gets all federal employees paid. And his view on the administrative state showed that it needed to be reformed based on effectiveness, very a pragmatic approach, but still acknowledged that it didn't respect some of the authorities and the rights that were constitution, like the idea of separation of powers and federalism, that was being largely ignored under our current system. So even today, some liberals acknowledge, yeah, our administrative state isn't working properly, it needs to be reformed and adjusted. And so I think this is something where it wouldn't be a entirely bipartisan agreement to change out the way the administrative state functions, but people recognize it as an issue. So now here's the next question. How did y'all get into your favorite hobbies? So for example, for me, cross country, how I got into it. Funny enough, my dad wanted me to do like a sport in high school. He said, either you do a sport or I'll make you do physical activity at home. So I did football because I like football. And so after that, I decided I wanted to stay in shape for football, so I did track for freshman year of high school, and then I was really good at it, and I decided to stick with it. So how I got into cross-country running and track running was predominantly from initially a desire to be good at football. It became something I really enjoyed. Oddly enough, when I was a kid, I hated running, and I told Dad I would never run more than 2 miles, and now I've gotten to the point where I at times run over 70 miles in a week. So yeah, that's how I got into running. I hope you all enjoy your week, and I'll hear from you soon.